afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for being in attendance for our next panel session. It's a fairly heavy, potentially, topic that we're getting into for the next 45 minutes or so. Safer workplaces, a trauma-informed and victim-centric approach. I'll introduce you to our panellists now. We have four amazing guests to introduce you to. I'll go from the far end. Narelle McMahon is with us. Thank you, Narelle. Narelle is a Regional Inspector of Mental Health and Wellbeing for WorkSafe WA Mine Safety Division. Narelle has worked in the mining industry for the past 28 years. She's very passionate about being a regulator that ensures workplace behaviour issues, injuries, psychosocial hazards and associated risk factors are addressed industry-wide. Narelle holds a bachelor degree in occupational health and safety, and since joining the WMSD, she's been an integral part in developing the mental health and wellbeing team. She's also been involved in the Mental Awareness, Respect and Safety program led by the Department of Mines Industry Regulation and Safety since its inception. So thank you, Narelle. Next to Narelle, we have Lorna McGregor. Lorna is the Chief Executive Officer at Lifeline WA, which I'm sure many of you, if not all of you, are familiar with already. Lifeline WA is part of the National Lifeline Network, the leading provider of suicide prevention services in Australia, delivering services that aim to prevent suicide, support people in crisis and create opportunities for emotional well-being. Lorna has a bachelor's degree and an MBA. She's previously worked as the Chief Operations Officer at Perth North Medicare Local and has extensive experience in mental health safety, service delivery, strategic and business development. Thank you, Lorna. Next to Lorna, we have Dean LaPlonge, a Senior Gender-Based Violence Specialist at Factive Consulting, a cultural research consultancy which explores new ways of understanding gender in resource industries. So for the past 2 decades, Dean has worked across the globe, supporting the efforts of international development banks and private sector businesses to improve prevention of and responses to gender-based violence. Widely recognised as an international expert in managing the risks of these behaviours in workplaces and in communities that are affected by business operations. He's been a leading voice in raising concerns about gender behaviours in the extractive industries, and in 2010 facilitated a groundbreaking roadshow for the Department of Mines in WA to explore how practices of masculinity affect safety on mine sites. Dean has a PhD in the field of gender and master's degree in international peace and conflict studies. So thank you for being with us as well, Dean. And just closest to me on the end there, Sandra Lamb, an endorsed organisational psychologist and managing director of FIFO Focus, a psychology firm that collaborates with various disciplines to empower individuals to become mentally resilient and support organisations to handle the complexities of psychological health, integrating and embedding wellbeing practices and psychosocial risk management with business as usual. She has over 2 decades of industry experience in both the public and private sectors in Australia and overseas, and is passionate about improving the mental resilience of individuals, teams and organisations. So they are our panellists. Would you please welcome them? Thank you, panellists. We'll try to throw the questions around to the panellists as much as we can. If you've got a question that you'd like answered by a particular panellist as opposed to all of them, then please just make that obvious in the question you put up on Slido, and I'll make sure that goes to the most relevant person. Let's start with perhaps the obvious question. I think they are fairly self-explanatory terms, but trauma-informed, victim-centric. What do they actually mean for people who are deeply involved in the space? What do those terms actually mean? Who wants to start?
Well, I'll defer to Sandra.
So in my view, I think it's an organisation that understands the impacts of trauma, knowing how to recognise signs and symptoms of those who are experiencing trauma, making sure we don't re-traumatise people through our policies and procedures, and integrating all of that knowledge into the way we do things in the workplace. That's the way I would like.
In a nutshell?
In a nutshell.
Dean?
I think it's, as well, to add on to that from a personal perspective, it is my right as somebody who has experienced trauma to have a say over how that is responded to. So the decisions that are made around what do we do next, and also my right to own the story of what has happened to me and tell that story, so that the story is not told for me by other people.
Okay.
I think it's understanding that people suffering trauma have suffered a psychological or emotional injury, and understanding that as a response to that injury, the person's brain is not necessarily operating in the way they normally would. Another part of understanding trauma is that people can recover from trauma like they can other injuries, but sometimes people don't fully recover, and so past trauma can impact and events can be triggering, and so people can have a traumatic response. So as a consequence, they may emotionally overreact and underreact, and it's being aware of that in how you deal with individuals who are suffering as a consequence of a traumatic event or are triggered by a traumatic event.
Yep.
Nora?
And from a regulator's point of view, we look at the re-traumatising the people over and over again. So the new psychosocial regs that came out, this is one of your psychosocial hazards. So that's another thing you need to look at. You just don't need to look at the physical things, but the re-traumatising of all parties, not just the affected person, but respondents, bystanders, everybody. So for us, it's about making sure that we don't re-traumatise people constantly in the workforce.
So why are we here today talking about this? What's been failing so far that we need to sit down and address this as a topic of discussion?
I think it's understanding that, look, I'll take a step backwards. For all workplaces, dealing with in a compassionate way and understanding trauma is problematic. Workplaces, by their nature, all workplaces are structures that are designed around outcomes, and they have systems that drive toward results. The mining sector, the resources sector, perhaps even more so because of the engineering nature of that. To deal in a sympathetic, compassionate and trauma-informed way requires patience and time. And the managers who are dealing with that tend to be, and Richard spoke about it in the previous panel, managers, all managers, but particularly managers perhaps in the resources sector, tend to be action-oriented. So what do we do when what we have to do is actively listen patiently and allow the individual that has been affected to articulate what it is they need and provide them what they need, not what you want to do. So I think that's why we need to talk about it. And the previous panel spoke about this being not just resources sector. That was something you raised. That's probably true of all workplaces, but particularly true of the resources sector, I think.
I also wanted to elaborate on what Nora was saying. So previously, traumatic events such as sexual harassment has occurred in the industry, and it's predominantly being investigated by human resources. But with the new work health and safety legislation, it's now a psychosocial risk, as Nora was saying. So that means your health and safety people are now also responsible for investigating, but for a completely different purpose, which is, have we had a failure of controls? So this is where it becomes really difficult, because now you have this affected person who will be interviewed by both the health and safety people for a completely different reason than the HR people who are normally interviewing for substantiation and disciplinary reasons. That's where re-traumatisation can occur. So we do need to be talking about this, because if we want to be people-centric, we need to understand that the person will be asked multiple times by multiple people for multiple purposes.
I think it's also important to point out that we're not talking about it because of failures. We're talking about it because the talking about it is a success of how far the industry has come and where it wants to go. There are gaps in terms of understanding in the industry around what is a victim-centric approach on the ground, not even just theoretically, but on the ground. How do we do this? And this is an opportunity to talk about those gaps, to understand it better, and to find out what are the tools and the solutions that the industry needs to have a much better approach to these to psychosocial incidents, factoring in the culture of the industry, factoring in the kind of leaders that have dominated in the industry, factoring in that this is an industry that traditionally has been heavily masculinized, and that a masculine approach, a typical man's approach towards these kinds of incidents is not the approach that's going to work anymore. So it's about learning, where do we go from here? How do we as an industry understand better what is a response that is going to be supportive of the people that are involved in the incident?
All right, well, flipping the phrasing that we're using here is celebrating the progress made in the years that you've at least been involved with the sector there, Dean. Can you give us an insight? What was it like in years gone by? How far have we come?
I mean, there are people in the audience, I'm sure, who've been in the industry much longer than I have. But I'm, on a personal level, working in the industry 15 years ago for me was horrendous at times on site, with the abuse, the physical abuse, the verbal abuse. I don't see that, I don't experience that as much anymore. It is still very much there, it's still very much happening, but I think we have now different tools and understandings to start addressing it, start calling it out. I do think, though, we're still at the very early stages of understanding what is a good practice response to somebody who reports an incident. I think we have a lot of work to do there.
Yeah. Starting with what? What do we need to do? What's first on the agenda?
Starting with stopping making the decisions for the people who are reporting. Starting with allowing those people and recognizing that it's not going to be the same response every time, but allowing the people to be part of the process of the response. This often goes against the way that we understand or have practiced the culture of mining to date. We make decisions on behalf of people, we protect people. We have to move away from that in order to have a good practice response to psychosocial incidents.
And this is quite a difficult space and quite nuanced, because as the employer and the manager, you actually have competing tensions. So while as a panel we're advocating trauma-informed practice and a trauma-informed approach, you still have a responsibility to procedural fairness for everyone involved in that. And you also have a business responsibility. So your three tensions are, you have the I don't like the word victim, but we'll say victim because that's in the title. So we have the victim. Similarly, I don't like the word perpetrator, but in the absence of another word, we'll use the perpetrator, who's entitled to procedural fairness. But you also have business demands, and within that business, you also have a community, and particularly in the resources sector, who have residential, you have a very engaged, 24 hours engaged community. So as a manager, you need to, or an employer, you have to manage those three conflicting tensions, and you don't have a choice of saying that's too hard. You have to find a way to manage those conflicting tensions. And an important part of that is understanding that and building that in. So in the previous panel, we heard about the investments in systems and processes and policies. Through that should be woven this understanding of trauma-informed practice and working out how you're going to manage those tensions. And I would go further and scenario test those, practice them, because in reality, if you have a very significant incident, it's hard work to make the decisions on the run. So you need to have those concepts embedded.
Can I ask, forgive me if this is an ignorant question, but if we're trying to avoid an affected person being re-traumatised by having to retell their story, I still can't get my head around how we realistically do that. If we are going to investigate a matter, surely there has to be a degree at least of retelling that story. I mean, I think of again, this might be a crude example, but someone who's a and again, to use a phrase that we're trying to avoid here, a victim of a crime, there might be an initial reporting to a police officer, and then, to a lawyer, and then it goes through the court process where it's interrogated even further. How do you avoid that re-traumatising from retelling a story if you are an affected person?
Can I jump in? So this is where I think training is actually very important. A lot of people to understand the impacts of trauma and how does that impact you. It impacts on your memory. So traditionally when we ask people what happened, most people who are traumatised may not remember exactly what happened because your brain's trying to protect you in numerous ways. So understanding the effects of trauma in that regard. Normally we ask, so what happened first, and putting it in a sequential way. Again, when you're traumatised, you can't think in a sequential way. So that level of training is really important. We understand the fight, flight and freeze type model. With trauma, there's the fourth one, which is to appease. So understanding what happens there, what happens to a person who feels like they're trapped in this scenario, they probably have to appease to survive. So I really think that people need to understand the impacts of trauma when you're working in an organisation, have to deal with whether you're investigating or responding to or managing those traumatic events.
I think you can also, it doesn't always work and it's not the same for every situation, but you can separate. You can look at the two things differently. You can look at the trauma that the affected person, as one of the people involved, has experienced, and you deal with that trauma in a particular way. That's not necessarily part of the investigation for them to retell. The investigation, or when you're looking at why did this happen, you're looking at the general incident. How do we, Sam mentioned this in the panel before, how do we look at ensuring that this kind of incident doesn't happen again? What are the controls that we don't have in place or that we can strengthen to prevent this incident happening again, and understand why this incident happened? In order to do the latter, I don't need to be constantly asking the affected people, tell me your story again, tell me your story again. Those can be separated.
And I think another part of it is the how they're engaged. So reducing in that process how often someone has to repeat the story, but also allowing people, providing people with the supports, but providing them with the active listening. So it's not, I just need to know the facts. To Sandra's point, they may not be able to repeat facts, but it's often about how they're engaged, not whether they're engaged. And part of trauma-informed practice would be the active listening and providing a safe environment and a compassionate environment, so that if they while they're telling the story, they're allowed to tell it in their way and in their time.
And I think also taking a case management approach wherever possible as well. So this is a situation where HR and health and safety do need to work together. So perhaps there is the one person who is in constant communication with the affected person, not multiple people. If we can get both sides to reach a whole bunch of questions that we need to ask the affected person, that might minimise the re-traumatisation as well.
Narelle, speaking for the regulator, are you comfortable with the kinds of mechanisms that are in place in industry in terms of the way affected people are talked to and managed if they have had some sort of traumatic episode happen to them? Are you comfortable where things are at?
Short answer, no. So we're not seeing, so anyone that knows me in the crowd, I do see a few familiar faces. When we ask for an investigation, we're not asking you if you sacked the person, we're not asking you to substantiate it. We have no issue with what you're doing there. What we want to know is, what are you doing to cease it happening again? So you don't need to know the particulars, and we will usually ask for an investigation and statement so that we don't re-engage with the people unless they want to engage with us. But what I'm seeing, quite frankly, all the time is we sack the perpetrator. That's it. So what have you done to stop it happening again? That's what we're looking at, and that's about the controls of what you're putting in place, not just sacking a person and then they're moving to the next mine site, to the next mine site, to the next mine site. Yeah, so that's the part that there's a lot of work to be done, which Not to take Dean's thunder, but when he presents later on this afternoon, there's a lot of recommendations out of the last roadshow we did, and that we'll be engaging with him to help with the trauma-enforced investigations.
Yeah. For anyone who's here this afternoon, Dean's going to deliver a bombshell address later on this afternoon, I'm sure. Some great questions coming in from the audience. Thank you so much for your submissions. An interesting point that I think we were going to get to at some stage anyway, but thank you for leading us here, whoever posted this question. How can we investigate grievances when the impacted person wishes to remain anonymous and the investigation may result in them being identified? It's a big hurdle, isn't it, for some people? Anonymity. How do you address that?
Yep, so we have a lot of ways that people can report to the department, which they do. Sometimes they just want to be anonymous from the company. And in that case, again, the people that know us, we go on a fishing trip, as we call it, and ask you about all your incidences for a certain amount of time to see if the person has actually been investigated, to see what the outcomes again are. So we're not there, again, not to substantiate or anything like that, but we're looking at what people on site are telling you. So from an overview, obviously it's a lot easier for us to look in and go, well, we're seeing clusters. Are you not seeing these clusters? And that way the person, once they've got to a stage where they're ringing the regulator, they're at the angry stage anyway. So they're quite happy to speak with us. But again, I will always ask them, if you're not happy with giving me a statement or just a synopsis of what's happened, email it to me. Put it in writing. Take out names you don't want in there. Very happy with that. And we go on and look at the company as a whole. We're not looking at that one investigation per se. That's up to your own companies to do. But yeah, and that's the biggest problem is those controls coming out of your investigation. It is not we sacked that person. It is we have done this to put in place. So it doesn't happen again. And whether that's around your procedures, how you're training your people, how you're consulting with your people as well. You've got all these diverse people in your workplace. If you're not consulting with them and asking them what their actual on-the-ground experience is, then you're never going to control any of these issues that you have there.
Anyone want to add to that?
I think you can. We get this question a lot. When people want to give anonymous reports, doesn't that make it extremely difficult to do anything about it? No, it doesn't. Absolutely not. I can make a report anonymously that something has happened to me that has caused me psychosocial harm. I can still access all the support services that you as a company make available to me without having to disclose who I am. Once I understand that there may be limitations on what an investigation can now do in terms of my specific case, but it doesn't prevent the company from saying, okay, we've had this report of this kind of incident. Let us look again at why these kinds of incidents might be happening across our business or within particular teams, within particular sites, and what is the work that we can do to prevent these kinds of incidents from happening again. So it doesn't deny the support to the individual, and it doesn't prevent the company from learning from the incident and putting in stronger preventative measures.
Yeah. I just want to take maybe not the reactive side, but maybe a proactive piece. So when we're talking about investigations and people wanting to report or not report, we're talking about injured already has happened. We know from a lot of research that people don't report because they don't think it's serious enough, they don't think anything will be done about it, they don't think they're going to be believed. So if we, as an organisation, culturally, we change that viewpoint, I think people report. But at the moment, anonymity is the only thing that they've got that's safe. So I think about the proactive part of it as well, not just the reactive, what to do when the damage has been done.
You've mentioned a few times already in the discussion about in-house services and trying to resolve things or address things internally. But I think this is a great question again from one of our audience members. Practical advice for smaller companies to build a trauma-informed, victim-centric approach without access to in-house specialists. I suppose anonymity might play into this answer as well. Sometimes, if you're part of a much, much smaller team, anonymity, keeping things sort of, close to your own chest is almost impossible, isn't it?
Yeah, we find that a lot. So a lot of the smaller companies will say to us, well, how do we investigate it? Well, you still got to investigate it to the best of your ability. If you do not have the skills, hire outside contractors to come in and help you. Early on in this journey, I spoke to a lot of SSEs and they'd say to me, okay, if it's a dump truck hitting something, all good. It's like, well, now you need to bring in the specialists to make you understand. And that, again, starts the training of the people within your organisation. But yes, very hard to be anonymous when you're in a small company.
Have you got any practical advice there, Dean?
Well,
for
I think it's
people?
also speaking to some of the gaps that we're starting to understand by speaking more to industry about this is the expectations, this is good practice, how is this going to work? One of the gaps is the lack of accessible, affordable training for people who are working in the smaller in the smaller companies, the smaller organisations, that they can understand at some level what is a better response to these incidents when they occur than we've currently got. And we know there are gaps in that kind of those kind of resources at the moment. So that's about having this kind of conversation to understand better those kind of gaps.
I think it's really important also not to use that as an excuse to avoid, and I'm not suggesting that the person who raised the question is doing that, because it's a very valid question. Obviously, if there are more resources, you can pay for training, you can bring in people to work on your policies and so on. But I don't believe, and here I'm going to sound very lifeline, you don't have to be a clinician to provide support, and you don't need to be a clinician to embed good practice in your organisation. If you understand that, I'd say there's just 4 really practical things. Firstly, understanding that trauma impacts the emotional response, that it is an injury. So you need to look at things differently. The second thing is to listen, to provide an environment, a safe environment where someone can tell their story in their way, in their time. The third is to listen for what supports that they want, not what you want to do. And the fourth would be to ensure fairness and assure them that they will be treated fairly, that there's no consequences. So that would be my shorthand checklist for small companies embedding trauma-informed practice into their policies and procedures.
Okay, so I think we've touched on it already, but training. What do we need to consider for managers and supervisors to assist them with a more trauma or victim-centric approach? How quickly can people attain these skills? Lorna, you might be in a good place to answer this one as well, because you are dealing with people within your own organisation that have to communicate with people who are probably having one of the darkest moments of their life.
Yes, that's absolutely true, and I guess Lifeline WA or Lifeline Network is proof that everyday people can deal with crisis in a very trauma-informed way. Of course, we invest a lot of training. It takes a lot of time to become a crisis supporter. Fortunately, most people don't need to be crisis supporters, but there is, Lifeline WA has adapted that training, has created training in how to listen and how to support people. Sandra also does train. There are lots of options there, all prices, all structures to meet the various organisational demands. So I would encourage people to look at what there is available and what might be fit for purpose.
The Mars program actually sponsored or gave us a grant to deliver specialist training in trauma-informed investigations. So there's been a lot of funding provided in that already, which is, it's a course that teaches people about trauma, how we need to work together as health and safety and HR to make sure that we don't re-traumatise individuals. It looks at how the 2 acts come together. Fair Work, Health and Safety Act needs to be considered when we're dealing with sexual harassment incidents. So there are some courses out there, not a lot yet, but there'll be more to come.
Narelle, you might be able to offer some insight into this one. The response to trauma in mine sites is as diverse as the people who respond. Is there going to be a minimum education expectation for first-line responders?
Not from a regulator point of view, when we don't put that in place, especially with the new regulations, because it's risk-based. Yeah, people wanted less prescription. This is what you got, risk-based. So it's up to you guys to train. But as a minimum, I know SARC are working with putting out kits, seek kits as they're calling them, and they're going to have and say, look, we need a minimum of education of what you guys need. So there's those pockets that do that. But unless you're looking at your statutory requirements, we don't prescriptively give that.
Can I ask, as the regulator, I know you can't talk about specific cases, but are you busy? Are your phones ringing off the hook with people wanting to report things at the moment?
Yes. I put it nicely. There was companies that came to us before the Enough is Enough came out and wanted to work with us directly. We will say a handful because there's not a lot. And that opened up for them. They're in a very good space. At the moment, they're reporting consistently to us, but we have other companies that aren't. So as I tell SSEs when they call me and they say, oh my God, we've had this horrendous thing happen on site. And I say to them, that's a good thing. People are reporting it to you. They feel safe. They feel safe that you're going to do something about it. But yeah, we still have a lot of people that aren't reporting. And that takes up a lot of our time because then we have to chase that reporting, which is something we do regularly. But we are under the pump. Our team of, when we first started out of 2, is now up to 8 with another 3 people to come on board. And I think we're going up to about a 15 of just the mental health and wellbeing team. Our other inspectors, though, they also take these cases as well. As a regulator, all of our inspectors are trained for everything, except these guys are more, have better backgrounds in the psychology and how to deal with everything. Yeah, but yeah, our phone never stops.
So for companies who are looking to take a more victim-centric approach or affected person approach, Narelle, which part of the company should be driving it? Is it HR? Is it the work health and safety people? Because I'm guessing particularly in a bigger organisation, they may not be pursuing the same goals as, say, the legal side of the company, the team of lawyers that might occupy a different part of the building. They might have slightly competing objectives here. Liability is a question that will be asked inevitably.
Yep.
At management level.
Yeah.
How does a company go about instilling a more victim-friendly process?
It has to be a holistic. If it's too heavily HR, it's going down the IR way, and that's not people-centric ever. Safety plays a huge part because you are the people that are keeping people safe, and it is in mental and physical safeness now. So definitely having the WHS people in your crews, definitely. But it's a holistic. Everybody has to be involved. You can't just say it's management pushing it because it's never going to get to the floor. And that's what we're probably seeing a lot of now. It's hitting probably people here, but we're not hitting the people on the floor. And that's a huge...
So that's what you're seeing as the regulator?
As the regulator.
It's still not right?
Yep, not right, no. When you're getting people, the amount of complaints that we get is quite big, and that's when you're seeing it's not feathering down, because it's nice to say we have all these policies in place, and I've been in the mining industry for the last 28 years. Your first day, when you're signing all your SOP, all 285 of them that you've read intently, and you remember everything about, you don't. So for us, when we go out somewhere and we go and talk to the SSEs and we go and talk to everyone, and they say, this is what we're doing. And then you go find the workers and you say, so if something happens to you, do you know what to do? And they look at you blankly. It's not working. If they don't know, they can report things. If they don't know that sexual harassment is not something they have to put up with, it's not working. So that's what we see our inspectors are saying all the time, is the people that are affected by this, they're not getting there. And to go back to the earlier one, a lot of the contractors, they're not seeing it at all. So with new regulations, contractors have to report to the PCBU now. We're now getting a lot of these contractors ringing us directly and going, has my PCBU reported this? Because we did report it to them to make sure that they're covered. But before that, they were not reporting to the PCBU because they'd lose their contracts. So the stigma away from that has to be taken. So KPIs around that should be taken off. It shouldn't be KPIs on any sort of injuries ever, because otherwise people don't report.
So those signs you see up in a workplace saying, we've been 112 days incident-free, you'd like to see those just everywhere, just thrown in the bin.
Especially too, because yes, people don't like LTIs, but when somebody's sitting in Royal Perth Hospital doing paperwork, that's an LTI. I'm sorry to say. You've hurt that person just because, and it's about they're not doing their normal job. So people will go, oh, they've got alternative duties using the photocopier. They still are not back at their job. There is an injury there, whether it's psychosocial or a physical injury.
Okay.
Sorry,
While I've got you there,
hit one.
Narelle, how does the regulator balance enforcement and trauma-informed practice?
So enforcement for us is not about the affected person, never is. This is about the PCBU not complying with regulation and the Act. So for us, when somebody comes to us or we are interviewing affected persons, we'll always ask for the interview from the companies or police, which we have MOUs with, before we even bring them in. If we bring them in, it's always on their terms. But we are not, especially, for example, a sexual assault, that is police jurisdiction. What we're looking at, what your controls were leading up to that assault. And obviously in early days, alcohol was a huge factor. Yes, companies now are trying to rein that in. Some are really effective at it. If you've got places where people are driving in, not as effective, those sorts of things. But it's around those controls that you have some control over. Yeah.
A couple of questions coming in around the issue of an affected person being heard, but then perhaps not wanting to pursue action from that. So how do we balance the duty of care and the wants of a victim then for no action to be taken? It's a tricky one for people who have to make these decisions, isn't it?
So as a regulator,
Yep.
we're happy with them stepping away. We don't put their name to things. We will never prosecute for the actual event like a sexual assault, but we'll prosecute, and which is always the worst case scenario for us. We prefer to work with people, so we go out and we work with them first if they are acceptable of that working with us. It's only going down the bad line when they're not.
Yep.
So that person doesn't need to be involved.
I think it's also a question of what do we mean by no action? Often,
Well, I suppose, just hypothetically, if someone is on the receiving end of something traumatic at the hands of a co-worker, and what is alleged to have happened there is proven and is a clear violation of company policy, but the person who's raised that, the victim, doesn't want it to be taken any further, the company might feel it has some sort of even legal obligation to take action. How do you address that? Do you hear what the victim, ideally wants here, no action to be taken, or is there an obligation on behalf of the employer, the company, the management, to actually do something?
but I think this is where the conflicting obligations come in as well.
Yeah.
But again, I still question what is no action, because no action we often interpret as not having a full investigation as a result of the complaint. And if we don't do that, there's no action taken.
Yep.
But the fact that somebody has reported and has been listened to, often in many cases, what most people want is for the behavior to stop. So if by having had that conversation, it allows me to start on that journey of trusting you to help me figure out how the behavior can stop, there is action being taken already. Just because we're not doing a full investigation doesn't mean as an organisation we're not doing anything. I have the right to request what goes on in terms of how we decide, how we deal with this. There was a very recent incident. Sorry, I think you wanted to talk to. There was a very recent incident that I was involved in on a mine site. This happened a couple of months ago, where there was a report of a sexual harassment. It was verbal harassment, and the employee reported it to their supervisor and wanted no further action, just wanted to have the conversation with the supervisor to make sure the supervisor was aware of the situation that had happened. The supervisor immediately went to HR. HR went into a full investigation. They interviewed the alleged perpetrator, they interviewed witnesses, they interviewed the person who'd made the complaint. Everybody knew now that this complaint had been made. They sacked the person who admitted that they had verbally harassed this other person. Nobody in that group wanted that as an outcome. It was very damaging on the team. It was very damaging on the organization. The person themselves was horrified, because the person who'd reported, because that is not the outcome they wanted. They actually had a relationship with the partner of the person who'd verbally harassed them. The person who'd verbally harassed them was mortified that they had behaved that way. They wanted an opportunity to learn and to change their behavior. It was a really bad outcome for everybody. And none of that needed to happen had they listened to the person who said to my supervisor, I trust you. I will tell you what has happened, and then we can continue the conversation. Now that we don't have that trust, now that that trust has been broken, nobody in that organization is going to report another incident.
And usually someone, when they say for a start, they should have agency. So if the victim doesn't want something done, that we have to respect that. That doesn't mean that there aren't systems, policies, culture that can be investigated. So going back to that conflicting priorities, you have a responsibility to your business, including your community, and accepting that the victim doesn't want anything progressed with their specific incident doesn't mean the duty of care obligations are overridden, and you still have a risk. And the risk may be in, and what should be investigated is systems, processes, culture, and that can still be investigated. So to Dean's point, it depends what you mean by do something. You can do something. It's taking. That sounds like an outrageously malleted black and white approach. Let's take a mallet and kill this off.
Absolutely.
When a much more nuanced approach could have found an appropriate tension between all those three needs.
Having said that, I think some people would have sympathy for the supervisor who probably felt an obligation to their employer to at least be seen to do something, perhaps out of fear of it bouncing back on them at some point for not acting. It's a really tricky one, isn't it?
So I think it's a psychological injury. So what do you normally do when an injury occurs and the person wants to go back to work? They do definitely have to have a choice. They don't want action, that's fine. But there may be temporary or permanent work adjustments, the same way that you would with physical injuries. So what do we do with this person? Do we have to change where they work, who they work with? Do we have to change their roster? All of those sorts of things is still a reasonable work adjustment, so we need to consider it from an injury perspective. And I think also I would vehemently encourage the person to seek support so that they may not be triggered by certain events as well. And if they are triggered, what do they do for self-care? So I think that piece we can always support that person to have as well.
Okay.
I guess I'm a little startled by how often people are getting sacked. That's a pretty extreme reaction, and there seems to be something a little theatrical in that. And I also would be concerned, and I'm sure this is something the regulator is concerned about, is that what are the underpinning reasons are not being addressed. Instead, there is this dramatic sacrifice being made rather than addressing the issues. And you spoke about that with somebody going to other sites. But there is a whole spectrum of responses that doesn't require a dramatic sacrifice to be made. Tim, you said you had some sympathy for the supervisor. I guess you could, but the role of a manager is to manage, and that includes understanding all responsibilities and all tensions.
I suppose that it's just one of those cases where you might feel like you're being pulled in different directions. And, you know, who is your ultimate obligation to? Is it the person under your command or the person who's in command of you? It's an interesting one. I think
we've spoken about that. I think again in the previous session around the tools that supervisors need and the importance of supervisors and team leaders to understand what is a survivor-centric approach to these kinds of incidents that my team might talk to me about. Having that knowledge is very, very important. Yep. I think just to the point of sacking as well, it's a common it just does seem to be the most common response to the reporting of these incidents, and it is one in so many responses that could be taken. And I think what we often do is we make the mistake of thinking these behaviors, these are the fault of a few bad individuals. And if we can just get rid of those bad individuals, that will change everything. No, it's all of us. We are all part of this culture. We are all we have all, I would pretty much guarantee, at some point in our lives engaged in some kind of behavior that has caused psychosocial harm to somebody else. It is part of our culture. There are root causes around gender inequality and discrimination that drive these kind of behaviors. It is for all of us to learn and have the opportunity to learn and change, like that employee wanted but was denied because of the focus on sacking.
And the chance of someone else in that workplace reporting has now declined.
Absolutely.
Because someone might say, I want something to happen, but I didn't want them sacked. And so if it looks like the automatic response is sack them, then people won't report. It diminishes the chance of reporting.
I think we have to leave it there. It's probably a nice place to end, particularly with your rousing call to arms there, Dean, at the end there. So thank you so much. Thank you to all of the questions submitted from the audience. And thank you, panellists, as well. Would you please thank Sandra Lamb, Dean LaPlonge, Lorna McGregor and Narelle McMahon. Thank you so much for your insights. We could have been here chatting all afternoon.